Welcome. We are now going to begin today's program. My name is Eileen McIntyre. If you have just joined us, please quickly check your audio setting to make sure that you can hear me easily so you can hear our presenter today. Also locate the Q&A or question and answer button at the top or bottom of your screen. That's where you can enter any question that occurs to you during the program, and we'll save those for after the formal remarks today. We are now joined by Marley McManus for the Hingham Historical Society. Marley?
Welcome to the Hingham Historical Society's third annual lecture series, Benjamin Lincoln's World, Stories from Colonial Hingham to the Early Republic. My name is Marley McManus, and I am the Development Manager for the Hingham Historical Society. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our board and staff from the Benjamin Lincoln home at 181 North Street in Hingham, Massachusetts. I'm seated in what the Lincoln family called the bourning room of the home, although we have learned from today's speaker that people certainly were not born or did not die frequently enough to warrant a dedicated room. And this space most likely may have served as the Major General's office, where he could have a vantage point from this window on the comings and goings on North Street. When the home of Hingham's Revolutionary War hero, Benjamin Lincoln, was put up for sale after over 350 years of ownership by the Lincoln family, the Hingham Historical Society launched a fundraising campaign, significantly supported by a generous Town of Hingham Community Preservation Act grant, voted at this year's town to purchase and endow the property so that it may enter its fourth century as a public historic site. In what has been an unprecedented year of challenges, we are incredibly thankful for Hingham's commitment, many of you joining us here today, to the preservation of American history. We remain grateful to the current homeowners, Rosie and Charlie Woodard and Franklin Beveridge, who have made this opportunity possible. This lecture series is an opportunity to learn more about Benjamin Lincoln, his family, and the inhabitants of this home and the world they lived in. We hope to close on the home soon and begin the work of preparing it and interpreting it as a public historic site. From a fundraising standpoint, we're off to a promising start. With approximately $1.5 million raised to date, independent of community preservation funds, we are poised to launch the next phase of our campaign, and we need your help. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire a national historic landmark here in Hingham, of which there are only two, and all of the treasures within it. We are setting our sights on phase two, a multi-million-dollar campaign to properly conserve, interpret, and open this priceless historic landmark to the world. Your support is crucial. I'd like to personally invite you to join us before the end of this year as a founding donor to the campaign for the Benjamin Lincoln House. Please visit our website at www.hinghamhistorical.org/donate, and we'll also be in touch with you with a variety of ways in which you can contribute. A final thank you to our volunteer historians and our dedicated education committee, co-chaired by Elizabeth Danis and Eileen McIntyre. And now I turn you over to Elizabeth Danis. Enjoy the lecture.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marley. On behalf of the Hingham Historical Society's Education Committee members, Ruth Gilbert Whitner, Andy Hertig, Kathy Curley, Marianne Bryan, and co-chair Eileen McIntyre, I also welcome you to the second lecture in our third annual Hingham Historical Society's lecture series. This series is entitled Benjamin Lincoln's World, Stories from Colonial Hingham to the Early Republic. Today, our topic is the evolution of Benjamin Lincoln's lifelong home, and we are joined live via Zoom interview by Dr. J. Ritchie Garrison, Professor Emeritus, Department of History at the University of Delaware, and former Program Director of the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture. Recently retired, Dr. Garrison was Professor of History at UD for almost 30 years, where he was Director of the Museum Studies Program. Prior to accepting a position at the university, Dr. Garrison was Director of Education at Historic Deerfield. He has taught college-level courses on American Vernacular Landscape, English Design History, Pre-Industrial Craftsmanship, and Seminar in American History, the Emancipation Project. Dr. Garrison received both his Master of Arts and PhD degrees in American Civilization from the University of Pennsylvania and a Master of Arts in History Museum Studies from State University of New York. Reprinted in 2003 with a new introduction, Dr. Garrison's first book was Landscape and Material Life in Franklin County, Massachusetts, 1770 to 1860. He also authored Two Carpenters, Architecture and Building in Early New England, 1799 to 1859, which was the winner of the Vernacular Architecture Forum's 2007 Abbott Lowell Cummings Prize for the best book in North American Vernacular Architecture. In 1989, he co-edited with Bernard Herrmann and Barbara McLean Ward, After Ratification, Material Life in Delaware, 1798 to 1820. And in 1997, he co-edited with Susan Smart Martin, American Material Culture, The Shape of the Field. He has published and reviewed numerous articles on a variety of topics, such as agriculture, farmers markets, beef trade, furniture makers, and militia exercise and frolic in Pennsylvania prior to the Civil War. That's a really fun article to read. Dr. Garrison enjoys membership in the American Antiquarian Society, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Before I turn over the virtual lectern to Dr. Garrison, there are just a couple of pointers. Today's program is being presented in Zoom webinar format, allowing for the best video and audio quality for the large audience we welcome today. All audience members will be muted throughout the program. To submit a question at any time, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which you can find on the top or bottom of your screen. All questions will be held until the conclusion of the presentation, which we expect to run just over 1 hour. We will answer as many questions as time allows. Our expectation is that we will conclude today's program at approximately 4:30 p.m. And now, joining us from his home in Delaware, Dr. Garrison.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Let me pull up my screen here and go up to the beginning of the lecture. I should probably start by acknowledging that the technology is extraordinary that now allows us to speak to you from various parts of the United States. In my case, from Newark, Delaware, which is the home that I've occupied for a number of years now while teaching at the University of Delaware. While you can't smell it, in fact, there's a pot roast on in the slow cooker out in the kitchen. And my point for you today to start with is that when you look at images of the General Benjamin Lincoln House, you really need to keep in mind that there's a whole sensory apparatus that goes along with these visual images, the sounds, the smells, the voices of people in the past who in fact lived in this extraordinary home, occupied this landscape in historic Hingham, etc. I first became acquainted with the house and with Rose and Charlie Woodard quite by accident, I might say. I had been visiting with a team to investigate the possibility of doing an annual meeting visit to historic Hingham, to the Hingham Historical Society. And I had been working in the Old Ordinary building just up the street from this important house. I was invited by Paula Bagger and the wonderful Eileen Miller because Deirdre Anderson had the good sense to be out of town on summer vacation at that point. Charlie and Rose are two of the most kind and I think gracious individuals I've ever met. And even though we had no invitation or prior arrangement, Charlie showed us through the house and shared with us a bit of the family history. It was, in fact, a dramatic introduction to the house. Now, my first impressions of the house were, of course, that it was enormous by the standards of colonial British America. And of course, the gracious front entry with the Major General Benjamin Lincoln up on the landing of the hall was my first real impression of the house. First impressions, however, are often quite deceiving. And as we were invited to begin recording the house with a very important team of scholars, you can see sitting on a chair behind the house in the screen on your right, Jeff Klee, who was then working in the Department of Architectural Research at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, was in fact mapping out the measurements of the house from its rear. Off to the right of him is Claire Dempsey, who is the current president of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, and in her own right, a major scholar in New England vernacular architecture, having taught architectural history and field research at Boston University for a number of years. Off to the left is a staircase that in fact comes from the early part of the 18th century. And it was that quickly became the cue to the fact that this house was far more complicated than what my initial impression would have suggested. So whenever you approach an architectural study, you begin by asking a series of questions. Why do things look the way they do? How did they get that way over time? And ultimately, what did they mean? Those are the kinds of things I want to begin to explore with you today. And in doing so, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we went about some of our architectural research, talk to you a little bit about what we uncovered and the process of doing that, and then finally to begin sharing some preliminary conclusions about the house and what we know about the Lincoln family as it experienced the building over time. I want to be very clear that at this stage, this is unfinished research. There is still much to learn from the documentary materials that are at the Massachusetts Historical Society and indeed in Hingham itself. That research has necessarily been postponed a bit because of the nature of the pandemic that we're engaged in. But just as a teaser for you, on the left side of your screen, you're looking at a hinge that comes from the 17th century. And when I first experienced the house, Charlie made it clear that the house itself probably dated back to the 17th century. The hinge exemplifies the nature of that distance in time. And yet, if you study it really closely, you can begin to see there are different nails on the door on the right-hand side of that hinge than there are on the left-hand side of the hinge. So that told me that the door probably had been pulled off at some point in its past and reapplied elsewhere. And that's actually a really important part of the story of the General Benjamin Lincoln House. We began our task by beginning to document the house itself. And in doing that, you start both with a camera and taking detailed photographic shots of the building, and by actually measuring the floor plan of the building. On the right of the screen, you'll see Jeff and one of my graduate students, James Kelleher, who is then finishing up his second year of study in the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture. And although you probably can't tell it, James is actually holding a laser measurer so that he can locate the windows on the floor plan. To the left is a detailed shot of the attic window on the west side of the house. And what I'd call your attention to in this slide are the layers of clapboards that you see there, each of them approximately 40 inches to as much as 4 feet wide, running in a line where their joints are. That's clear evidence that these are early clapboards, scarfed, that is to say, cut at a diagonal angle so they overlap one another. The floor plan that resulted, and this is the preliminary results of the floor plan, we are still refining this, looks like this. It's clear that the house had gone through multiple iterations, and we really couldn't tell at that point precisely how old certain portions of the building are. In a sense, we still can't tell that, and for reasons I hope that will become clearer over the course of this talk. As I said, we had begun documenting the old ordinary, the Andrews house, further up the street. In doing that, we were using advanced techniques to not only study the house architecturally, grounded on its already very fine historic structures report, but also beginning to do some additional scientific kind of testing in order to try to tease out what the evolution of the building looked like. In the process of our examination, we ran across the fact that someone, thankfully, had inscribed the date of 1686 on one of the joists in the basement of the house. And while I suspect that the electrician who installed the electrical box just below it must have seen that date, apparently nobody had noticed it previously, probably because the basement was so dark. To the right, on the right-hand side of the screen, Bill Flint, a colleague of mine and longtime architectural conservator, now retired from Historic Deerfield Incorporated, is doing a core sample of one of the timbers in the basement of the old ordinary. And what he's doing is a form of dendrochronology in which you study the tree rings that are revealed by the core sample under a microscope to try to find out the age that the timber was installed. Now, one of the things we learned from that is that the old ordinary was indeed way more complicated than we had ever imagined, because the lean-to roof and its kitchen out the back of the house was in fact part of the first period of construction, 1686 to 1687. To the right in that lower screen, that sort of really peculiar looking bluish purplish color, is an FLRI scan. All that really stands for is forward-looking infrared. And what it's doing is it's reading the wavelengths of light that are coming off, showing the different heat signatures of one of the walls in the upstairs bedchamber. Above it, you'll see in natural light what that bedchamber reveals. And below it, what you'll see are the screenshots from the infrared, which are showing you a kind of whitish stripe. And I've enhanced this with the double-ended arrow that you'll see tilted at an angle. And what that's showing you is the principal rafter that still survives in that one wall. And in the rendering that I drew on the left, you'll see what it would have looked like joined to the original building. So we had been doing this kind of advanced scholarship in the old ordinary, and we simply began transferring some of the insights from that to the Benjamin Lincoln House. And we began, of course, by studying the house carefully, simply looking at it and studying the details that we could see. we quickly looked, as do most architectural historians when they start this kind of process, in the basement, because typically the evidence of the original structure is most visible in basements and attics, the places in a building that people are least likely to change because they tend not to be formal living spaces subject to the alterations of style, time, and changes in ownership. And what we quickly learned, of course, is that as we stood looking at the basement of the Benjamin Lincoln House, we noticed as is typical of houses in southeastern Massachusetts, with the exception of a small area now used as a basement, most of the house, in fact, sits barely above the grade level of the property with a very narrow crawl space and is simply propped up on timbers. To the right-hand side of the screen, you're looking at the timbers in that basement, and you'll see that there's a series of notches or mortises in some of the joists used to support the floor above. They're in the wrong place. We knew that as we looked at it. Clearly, these timbers were reused as floor joists, and that there was a larger story to tell about the Benjamin Lincoln House. In doing dendrochronology, and this is a photograph of Bill Flint holding one of the attic floorboards up, if you look carefully at that floorboard, you'll see that there's white paint on the bottom of the floorboard, hidden from view until we pulled it up. And interspersed amongst it are the areas that never got painted, which are where the floorboard had been nailed onto the joists of the attic floor. Clearly, that floorboard had been exposed at some point in the building's history. And yet it didn't seem, those ghosts that you see there didn't seem to correspond precisely to the area that we pulled up. To the right are the stairs up to the attic, and hidden behind it, and I'll show you another shot, close-up shot of this in a moment, are the attic stairs with 17th century creased floorboards. The attic itself was filled with information. There are chalk inscriptions up there, some of them written by children. There's a date which seems to read October 17th, 1776, and an attic wall that in fact shows the earlier roof line on what we think was an addition to the house done in 1721-2. We'll come back to that in a moment and look at it more closely. The archaeological evidence of that roof line appears in this notched area, which as far as we can tell is about all that is left of the 17th century portion of the house. It's not that Charlie was wrong in telling us that the house dated back to the 17th century. It's that as far as the evidence suggests, the 17th century house was taken down and the parts that existed from it were reused in building a later house. So what you're looking at are the roof lines of the Phase 1 house with a lot of detailed information about the angles and slopes of the roof, and probably even what the ridgeline looked like, where they tried to seal out the weather by raising one portion of the boards above the one that faces to the south. And that's why there's a slight notch there at the top where all of the arrows join together. Above it are riven clapboards, the kinds of clapboards held in place with wrought nails. And the wrought nails tell us that this was at least no later than the late 18th century, early 19th century. And behind it, in fact, applied to those clapboards is plaster. I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. You can also see there an inscription that reads Hannah, and although it's less visible, BL. Those are Benjamin Lincoln's children. So what did we learn from the beginnings of this intensive investigation? Well, the dendrochronology dates that came back suggested that, in fact, the earliest portion of the house that survives to the present was built, we call it Phase 2, but it was built in 1721 to 1722. It comprises what we now think of as the dining room and a good portion of the kitchen behind it. You can see the staircase on the right. This is the type of staircase that was in fact typical of houses built in the early part of the 18th century, and with some variation were known even in the 17th century. I'll have more to say about that in a few minutes. In looking at this kind of architecture, it's critical not to see the house in isolation, but to think about how it fits together with other buildings, not only in Hingham, but also in Massachusetts more broadly, particularly in eastern Massachusetts, where the original settlers came to. That meant comparing with things in Plymouth County, with things in Boston, but particularly with things in Hingham. And so the two comparisons that I'm showing you here, on the left is that first period staircase that survives, i.e. from phase 2 of the Lincoln House. And on the right is an early set of stairs from the Cushing House. Again, oops, pushed in the wrong direction. There's plenty of evidence of the reuse of 17th century parts in the Lincoln House. This is one of them, creased molding of the type that was used clearly in the 17th century. Those of you who are familiar with the Old Ordinary will see many examples of creased moldings in the Old Ordinary, which does retain much of its 17th century structure intact, although portions of it have been remodeled. What we also see, however, are a tremendous amount of reuse of earlier building materials. And this shows up particularly in the roof of the Lincoln House. And I've tried to label these parts because there's nothing more tedious to a public audience than to have an architectural historian throw out a bunch of terms that are in fact only known or understood widely by architectural historians. So what you can see on the left-hand side of the screen is a principal rafter. This is the main supporting rafter that helps hold up the roof of the Benjamin Lincoln House. Horizontally laid into that roof, that principal rafter, are common purlins, which is a typical form of roof construction used in southeastern Massachusetts and certainly known in England as well. What you may not know if you don't pay attention to some of the details is that the notches in the common purlins were designed to fit into notches in the principal rafters. And what's going on here is that they don't line up with the principal rafter. The common purlins have clearly been taken off and reused from an earlier structure. Equally puzzling is the back of the chimney stack in the Lincoln House in the first period of the building, 1721-22. That is the first period that survives, phase 2. So here's the phase 2 house with the rooms named as near as I can determine them. The hall, which is now the dining room, was located there on the lower left corner of the building. This would have been the principal living quarters of that portion of the building. A kitchen was probably where it is now, and what now is a bathroom, hallway, and closet was most likely an original pantry, although what it would have looked like in its first period, we aren't entirely sure. The entry where the stairs are located is below the chimney stack on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And although there's a window there now, it may well have had a door entering into this small entry in much the same way that the entry to the original Old Ordinary would have looked like. Inside, particularly on the second floor, where more of the first period of architecture when this addition was put on was attached, you can see the paneling up above it. And if you look carefully at the large molding that extends around the fireplace, you'll see what is known as a Bolection molding. These Bolection moldings earlier on were much larger than they were later. If you look at the image on the right-hand side of the screen in the southeast parlor chimney piece, that Bolection molding is much smaller and more characteristic of the mid-18th century and later. So let's take a look at some of the interior details to try to understand how and why the house was used the way it was. One of the details is the addition of this plaster in the attic space applied directly to the clapboards. I have to say this is an extraordinarily rare survival of finish work in an attic space, and it puzzles modern visitors because they have no experience with how these attic spaces were used. They were, in fact, very often not just storage places the way we tend to think of them today, but were in fact living quarters where people would have slept up there, even in the wintertime, although there's no chimney or fireplace up there. There's a chimney, but not a fireplace to keep you warm. What people thought were adequate living spaces in the 17th or 18th century are often very different than what we would have experienced today or expect to experience today. So looking back, as you study the attic of the Lincoln House, and it is one of the most important sections of the house for determining what we know about the building, what you can see are the layers of family history. And it's those layers of family history, including a very early window sash, probably original to the 1721-22 phase of the building. Phase 2 is there on the right-hand side of the screen. So what can we hypothesize? Based on the dendrochronology analysis, the phase 1 17th century house was probably demolished during phase 3. The oldest portion of the building is 1721-22, and the phase 1 and phase 2 portions of the dwelling appear to have housed different generations of the family, probably with separate entrances, although we can't tell that now because phase 1 was demolished. Sometime about 1765-67, the eastern end of the structure, where Marley was talking to you from the office space, was likely rebuilt, incorporating many of the earlier dwellings materials, including those from the 17th century. There are later changes as well. Those are visible, and they're an important part of the history of the house and why it looks today the way it does. Now, it's all well and good to observe these things as part of the architectural fabric of the building, but to what extent does the family history line up with the changes that are visible from both the dendrochronology and from the architectural evidence that survives in the building? We know a bit about the history of the Lincoln family from its genealogy published in the history books on the history of Hingham. And the one that I'd call your attention to here, as I won't go, this is not a discourse in family genealogy, and I'd quickly lose you, and in fact exceed my own knowledge about the family history. But the point I'd call your attention to is number 4 here, Colonel Benjamin Lincoln III. Notice that in 1721, he married a woman named Mary Loring, and not long after their nuptials, she died. So the date of their marriage corresponds to the phase 2 addition to the house, the 1721-22 dates that we got out of the dendrochronology. Benjamin Lincoln, the Colonel, Benjamin Lincoln III, married a second wife, Elizabeth Thaxter, and it is their children that included Benjamin Lincoln and his brother Bela. And Bela's picture, his wonderful pastel picture, probably by Benjamin Blythe, is exhibited here to the left-hand side of the screen. Bela was the one that went off to college, while Colonel Benjamin's son, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, took over the operations of the family property. And Bela Lincoln was connected to the very prominent Quincy's and the Adamses. They were all friends. And Bela Lincoln's wife was a Quincy. Unfortunately, Bela Lincoln died in 1773, shortly before the Revolution and before he and his wife had children. It is Benjamin Lincoln IV, 1733 to 1810, and his wife, Mary Cushing, 1734 to 1816, who were really the principal architects, at least in terms of setting the process in motion, of the way the house looks today. And the critical documents that are associated with this included the deed from Benjamin Lincoln III, the Colonel, written in 1764, in which for £5, he sells to his son the dwelling house in which he lives the malt house, a half of the barn, half of the land adjoining the barn, and also the land in his orchard near Broad Cove. And that same year, Benjamin Lincoln's bride, Mary Cushing, inherits 133 pounds. So beginning then in the 1760s, 1764 to 5, the Lincolns not only came into control of the property, and probably it was the property that included the Phase 1 17th century house, but also acquired the funds through Mary Cushing that enabled the family to begin the major alteration of the house that resulted in Phase 3. So to look at the plan highlighted in blue and this sort of marigold color here, you're looking at Phase 2 and Phase 3. I've subtracted the L off the back because it's confusing and harder to understand the phases of the building if we don't do that. The Lincolns were no different than many other families of their rank and estate. They priced in their priorities, and one of their major priorities was building a very grand staircase, which is still the one that is there today. These are amongst the most costly forms of architectural detailing in the 18th century, and you can see that in both the detail shot of the turned balusters as well as the graciousness of the stair itself, somewhat exaggerated because of the very wide-angle lens I was using when I took the photograph. But there are other details as well that call attention to the fact that wives, not just the husbands, are critical in the ways in which these buildings evolve and change. And more than the wives and the husbands, it's important to understand that Benjamin Lincoln didn't put this house up, neither did Mary. The house was put up by a series of skilled artisans who together, working in their areas of specialty, masonry, plastering, carpentry, painting, turning, and other forms of architectural detailing, put together the house the way it looks today. And although they're hard to see because they're often in shadow, when you pay attention to the details again, you start to see patterns. And one of those patterns is in the parlor of the Major General Benjamin Lincoln House. And what you're looking at here is a stoveplate, a Pennsylvania stoveplate that shows a scene from the Bible of David and Goliath. What's curious about this is that on the right-hand side of the screen is David and Goliath in the Cushing family house, now part of the Cushing Farm. And so we need to study a little bit about the Cushing Farm to get a sense of what was going on there. Because wives are just as important and wives' families are just as important as the husbands' families in planning these kinds of major life events. The Cushing Farm is one of the great architectural survivals in Hingham. And Carrie Carson's drawing of the evolution of the house, which appears there on the top left side of the drawings, shows the south elevation dated about 1679. We've refined that date a little bit. It was probably closer to 1682 based on dendrochronology done by Bill Flint in the house. But you can see its change on the south elevation when the roof got lifted up and the cross gables on the front, those two cross gables with casement windows, were removed. And that actually happened well before 1762, probably sometime around 1711 to 17, based on the dendrochronology. I don't have time today to go into the construction of the barn and the other outbuildings, but it's a really important survival in the history of Hingham. Now look carefully at the earlier phase of the Cushing Farm. There you see crease molding still intact in its original location in the hall of the Cushing Farm, much like those we saw in the staircase up to the attic in the Benjamin Lincoln house. To the right is the family parlor, and that family parlor probably was remodeled in the mid 18th century. I'm dating it around 1762. It might have been actually a little bit earlier than that, but it's roughly coincident with the kinds of things that we see in the Benjamin Lincoln house. In fact, if you compare the two, you'll see some remarkable parallels between these buildings. On the left is the Cushing Farm Parlor. On the right is the Lincoln House Parlor. The Lincoln House Parlor probably dating around 1767, maybe a little bit later than that. We did get one really good dendrochronology date out of the phase 3 portion of the building that dated to 1767. But look at the two parallels. Why do they look so much the same? Well, not because the Cushings and the Lincoln were copying one another necessarily, but because they may very well have hired the same builder, and the builder did what he was familiar with. Now, the two portraits that still survive in the Lincoln House, the wonderful portraits of Benjamin and Mary Lincoln done by John Rubens Smith, an important British artist who came to Boston and did those wonderful scenes, later lithographed, of Boston and the cutting down of Beacon Hill. I've actually reduced the size of the Major General here in favor of pointing out that in understanding the Lincoln House, you cannot underestimate the impact that Mary Cushing Lincoln had on the house, not only in terms of the financial contributions they made to the household, but also in terms of her connections to the broader array of kinship networks in the town of Hingham. Mary Lincoln, after all, principally ran the house while the general was away during the Revolution, and she was instrumental in how the house ran and why it looks the way it does. So what did the Lincolns do architecturally? Well, it's a little confusing at times to look at it from the front, in part because the huge front door was altered later in the 19th century, and the windows have been enlarged probably in the early first third of the 19th century. But basically, they unified the front visual elevation of the house so that it looked like one single house instead of two houses housing two separate generations of the family incorporated in phase 3 and phase 2. Most of that would have happened in the way it currently looks after the Colonel died in 1771 and Bela died in 1773, allowing the Lincolns, that is to say Benjamin and Mary, to consolidate ownership under a single family. So as we look at it and look at what I've conjectured was the room use, you can see here that the original 1721-22 section retains its use as a kitchen, a dining room, and a pantry, but the phase 3 expanded to create a stair passage, a new and very posh parlor in the middle, second third of the 18th century, what was likely to be a sitting room, an informal room to the rear, adjacent to the kitchen, and then the general's office off to the northeast corner of the building, which, as Marley observed earlier, was most likely the surveillance point that allowed the general to keep track of what was going on in the property. Now, like all houses of this period, even though this house was enormous by colonial standards and of much greater sophistication than most houses, even in Hingham, you're looking at degrees of formality and critical room uses of a house that would have centered at one point or another around the need for sustenance, about the use of food. The current kitchen is, of course, really a reflection of the early 19th century changes to the building, and where the refrigerator was located was probably in part the likely location of the bake oven in the phase 2 portion of the building. But we really can't tell that because that portion of the kitchen fireplace has largely been demolished. The dining room looks substantially as it did, and you'll notice that one of the earlier features of the building is the summer beam, that beam that's up dividing the ceiling space into two, the major beam up above the center of the table. But they also added a more formal federal style, neoclassical style mantelpiece to the earlier 18th century paneling. And if you look upstairs, you'll see in the phase 2 portion of the building, the bedchamber with its summer beam, and in the phase 3 portion of the building, the parlor chamber to the right, which I actually suspect was Benjamin and Mary's real bedroom, not the one where the bed is located today, you'll see this very elegant paneling that you see there. Indeed, in the 1760s, it might have had that an open ceiling before it was originally plastered over. The office space is telling in its own right, because one of the things that's extraordinary about the house are the number of fireplaces in it. And the office space with its angled chimney and fireplace off to one side would have been ideal for keeping the general warm in the wintertime when he was either keeping his accounts, engaged in correspondence, or doing various kinds of family-related business operations. To the right, even though it's sagging a bit today, is a fireplace from the first phase 2 portion of the building to survive, which shows that even this was heated. Honestly, I can't actually estimate the amount of cords of wood that it would have taken to heat the house during the 18th century, but it was probably in the vicinity to 30 or 40 cords of wood in an annual winter. The sitting room, in many ways, is the central meeting place, and as near as I can tell, Rose and Charlie often sat here, and it not only had its own fireplace to keep things warm, but controlled access to the rooms above, and indeed, in the hinge door that you see there next to the upper stairway, the basement stairs that ran down to the basement, and where by the 19th century, a central furnace would have been located. So as we think about the house and how it was used today, we can see that there are clear zones of formality and use. A kind of lowbrow zone to the rear, which isn't really very lowbrow. It was a sophisticated workspace where the family could kick back and live life more informally. And the more formal highbrow spaces to the front, which had a higher level of architectural finish, and where the general, who was, after all, one of the more important people in Massachusetts in the late 18th century and early 19th century, and connected to all of the Boston major mercantile elites, would have, if not held court, then would have entertained not only prominent residents within Hingham, but from those further afield. Family, however, in both the 17th and the 18th century, consisted not just of family members who were related by kinship. It also included anyone who would have lived in the house, who would have partaken meals in the house, who would have worked in the house, and who lived in the house in their own particular quarters. And nothing is more complicated than thinking about Robert's room in the attic of the Benjamin Lincoln House, an extraordinary survival of a space that may or may not have housed an African American. We need to take a look at Robert's room, but we also need to take a look at it in context, because these types of spaces, attic rooms, whether the plastered ones that you see in the phase 2 portion of the building, a detailed shot of which is over here on the left, or Robert's room, which contains a door that is in fact of very high status, but reused from down below in the 1760s phase 3 section of the house. What can we say about Robert's room? What did it mean? What does it tell us about the occupants who lived in these types of spaces in the 18th and 19th century? And before we get caught up in current conversations about class, about race, about the ways in which people interacted with one another, we need to remember that many people in the late 18th century, throughout all of the colonial era, would have lived in a variety of spaces, many of them very small and closed off. If you were aboard ship as a sailor, or even for that matter, a master mariner, a captain of a vessel, if you were impoverished and living in an attic because that's all you could afford, then you lived in very small spaces, and not necessarily spaces that we would consider finished by 18th or 19th century standards. And yet, as you look at the interior of this space, you see a series of adjustments that are visible if you put enough light on them and you study them in detail. A sliding shutter to close out the light. Clapboards that cover the spaces that have been caulked in effect with horsehair. You can't see that in the slide, except maybe a little bit of the seams. And the soot and charring from candle flames that appear here as well actually as in the old ordinary. I think the sleeping area for this space was probably underneath the eaves, off to the right of the doorway when you enter, but we'll never probably know for certain. Paula Bagger may in fact have more evidence because she's the one who's been doing most of the late research on Robert, and there was a Robert, although we don't know very much about him yet, and we don't know in fact whether he lived in the house. But as you look at the house today, we need as well to think a little bit about Benjamin and Mary Lincoln, their children, and their successors who lived on the property. The house itself has changed now. It has what we would today call a kind of living room, maybe a den, a kitchen, a library as it's often known today, the powder room, storage spaces, and the buttery. This form of selective change is important to understand because I'm looking here at both the continuities that Benjamin and Mary Lincoln introduced to the house and the ways in which the family has adapted to these changes over time subsequently. What we can see in early photographs of the house, in fact, are a little bit different than what we see today. You'll notice there's a porch on the front of the house on this slide, probably late 19th century, but maybe early 20th century. And behind it was a very large shed, which I suspect was, as much as anything else, a space to store all of that wood that would have gone into the house's heating during cold months of the year. The telephone poles, which with their cross wires, in fact, may actually be trolley line poles, although I don't know if Hingham had a trolley line on North Street at this point, may in fact tell you something about it. But if you look carefully too at the fences, they are denoting the spatial use of yards and behaviors in this particular part of the house. Also denoting spatial use are the ways in which storage areas to the rear in the L and the bedrooms above would have sorted out family life in particular moments in time. These probably added in the late 18th or maybe the early 19th century. We were unable to get dendro dates out of them to conform to a clear understanding of when these spaces were added. This little tiny window there in this storage space may suggest that at one point, then a corner of the building there was privy, but short of doing archaeology and tearing the building apart, we really can't determine that at this point in time. Equally interesting, and with a preservation easement assigned to Historic New England, is the very important buttery with its original shelving. This was on the very northwestern corner of the house, the coldest side of the house during most of the year, and would have in fact been an important storage area for a wide variety of foodstuffs, including perishables. It's plastered, it's tightly controlled. It was designed to at least inhibit mice and other critters from getting into the space and partaking of food supplies. It is also an example of how the family was frugal. They simply reused many parts of buildings when they created this door. I've never seen a door like this. This door is a masterpiece of make do. With its multiple locks, with a door that has been widened and lengthened so that it is much taller. It is comprised of wrought nails, cut nails, and even modern screws with modern hinges. It is an exemplar of the ways in which the Lincoln family has lived in the house and adapted to conditions over time. Lest we forget, the house is also an example of how living standards of hygiene, of health, of the aging of bodies of different family members have constrained, altered, and inflected the meaning of the house's interior. incorporating plumbing, incorporating the furnace to heat the steam radiators, in adding electricity. So what we are left with are several kinds of conclusions. The building is an exceptional survival of family history and material culture. It exemplifies the ways in which many families did not live in single-family homes, but in extended kinship networks that persisted over long periods of time. The evidence of the people who lived there, all of the people who lived there, is important, not just the life of Major General Benjamin Lincoln IV. Mary Lincoln, his wife, was a critical actor in her own right, as are her children and descendants. The house itself is a form of polite architecture that emerged in the United States, at least in the 18th century. But many of these behaviors have persisted right to the present day and seem familiar to people even in the 21st century. I caution you, however, that the house is a lesson in what changed and what did not. And in teaching us to add a more nuanced understanding of how we think about history, how we think about what can change and why it should change the way it does. In many respects, the house is a set of empirical answers to the questions that we bring to them. I thank you for your patience and for your willingness to listen to this long talk.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. And we have a few questions. People are being a little shy, so please start typing away if other things occur to you. First of all, question, there's evidence of 2 kitchens in the house if it was once a multi-generational house?
Most likely. The Phase 1 house almost certainly would have contained its own kitchen. And the kitchen that now survives, that was part of the Phase 2 portion of the house, would have been a second kitchen. So each household would have had likely its own kitchen. When Phase 1 was most certainly demolished, that kitchen was essentially rebuilt, and the chimney stack on the eastern end of the house, I'm almost certain, would have been rebuilt as a part of the remodeling.
And related to that, when we talk about multi-generations in a house, you were saying that Phase 1 and Phase 2 most likely had even had 2 separate entrances. I'm wondering, based on your experience, how common were multi-family homes of that type during this time period?
The answers to that are complicated. In the case of the Lincolns, they were a wealthy, very prominent Hingham family. The house, even with its addition in Phase 2, would have been very large by 17th and even early 18th century standards. Many families would have had multi-generations living in them. This is particularly true as New England towns aged, because what happens is the available farmland is divided up, and your children often ended up living with you. So the modern experience in the 21st century, where the kids don't automatically go off after they come back from their schooling and live for a time with their parents, has its precedent in the past. This seems to wax and wane depending upon the economic health of the country at any given moment, and the willingness of people to leave home and move to other parts of the country and other kinds of employment activities. So I think in the case of Hingham, it could be experienced as it was at the Lincoln House, in 2 separate sections of the house that were partitioned off for different generations. What happens, of course, is that the colonel, that is to say Benjamin Lincoln III, his mother in effect was living in the house next door. And his widow, she had rights over the house. So he couldn't just throw her out. And the solution when he married was to build an addition to the house, which allowed him not only to help look after her, but at the same time not invade her widow's rights. I can't prove that yet, largely because much of the archival records are still closed off or difficult to access for researchers. but that's my hypothesis going into it. These generational changes and the ways in which wills operated are often the controlling factors that sorted out who lived where and under what circumstances. There's plenty of other evidence, however, that in smaller houses, widows and their children literally partition off, and this is prescribed in the probate documents, who had access to the kitchen, whether they had rights to pass through a hall, whether they could cook in a kitchen, whether there would be a separate kitchen, and in many cases, whether they would simply have their own rooms or not. So it was much more common than many people realize.
So this is a slightly different question about generations of Lincolns. How many generations of Lincolns lived in the house? I think that question is about over the full period of the life of the house. And I know you're not a genealogist,
I am not.
but you.
The short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
The more complicated answer is a number of them, but probably Charlie could tell you quite precisely how many generations lived in the house. And also, please note that there would be people who moved in for a period of time and moved out, and in some cases moved back again. I had a wonderful talk with Franklin Beveridge, who talked a bit about how he lived in the house and moved around to different rooms, and in fact then moved away. So his generosity with the Woodards in partially giving the house as well, or at least I think selling it at a lower price than might pertain on an open market, it is in part about the stewardship that those members of the family have sensed over a long period of time for the house. There is a family identity with the house, and it's really quite extraordinary.
And Deirdre just shared with me by text, 11 or 12 generations of this family have lived in this house.
Yeah,
so quite remarkable.
Really extraordinary.
A very important question, and one we can't fully answer now, but I will raise it here. Could Robert have been a slave? And I know that you've had some back and forth with Paula about what she's been uncovering. What I can tell you is a couple of things. One is that we're having a program in November that we will share as much information as we've been able to clarify by that time, and that this is also an ongoing topic of study. Robert, there may have been more than one Robert.
Yes.
We know that there was a Robert who was a free Black man who worked for the Lincolns for a period. We don't know if this is a Robert who could have been a slave at one point previously. As you heard from Dr. Garrison, one of the keys to answering some of these questions is getting at documents that Mass Historical Society has in their archives that are not available to us right now during the COVID period, because you can discover much, unfortunately, through wills, because people who were enslaved, sadly, are then treated as property when it comes to wills. So you discover a lot of information from those kinds of documents. So we have an ongoing project, all volunteers, and we encourage you, if you have a copy of the brochure for the lecture series, we encourage you to join us in that research. Some of it can be done online now, but much will remain to be done when the archives at Mass Historical reopen. So that's a long question to a long answer to a question that's still important to be answered.
I should note that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts outlawed via a court case slavery in the Commonwealth in 1783, at the end of the Revolution, basically in July of 1783. So in fact, it was one of the earliest states to outlaw slavery. And at that point, all existing slaves were immediately freed. That is not the case in many other states. And so the history of enslavement is a very complicated one, in both for Massachusetts as well as for the other New England, Middle Atlantic, and Southern states, with a long and very sad history. As to whether the Lincolns owned slaves or not, I don't know yet. Probably Paula and others can answer that more effectively than I can. But do understand that how we are still learning a huge amount about the kinds of living conditions that enslaved Africans experienced in New England, in the Mid-Atlantic, and even in the South. There were whole sections of the South where slavery was very common, where there were no slave quarters, and enslaved Africans would have lived, in fact, in the main dwelling house with the family. We know that in many cases, out kitchens down south would have in fact been de facto slave quarters where enslaved Africans would have lived apart from the family. And even more curiously, we know from 17th century archaeology and historic documentation that out kitchens and outbuildings in portions of the South, even areas such as Rhode Island, probably predated the common use of slaves in portions of the South and the North. So I'm not trying to mask over the situation so much as to suggest it's an extraordinarily complicated part of American history, and one that I'm happy to say is receiving a great deal of attention and serious research.
So we do invite you to tune in November, and it will be a work in progress, but we will have some information on what we know about slave ownership in Hingham, as well as the triangular trade and how Hingham was involved in that, which supported slavery basically in the British West Indies. So more to come on that, an evolving study, area of study, and you'll hear more in November. Question about where in the house do you find materials that you think were from the first phase house?
I think they're all over the third phase of the house. We were pulling up attic floorboards. You can see not all of them are visible. And the problem is that you'd have to literally tear apart sections of the house in order to find 17th century materials. The clearest visual source of them is in the stairs up to the attic, from not the phase 2, 1721, 22 stairs, but the ones that were added in the 1760s. I think the common purlins that I pointed out in that slide that have been reused, those could very easily have come out of the 17th century. We did test those with dendrochronology, but because they're a pine and it's really difficult to get good dendro information out of pine, we were unable to document that they are 17th century in nature. So we were seeing 17th century pieces of the building, but we think effectively the 17th century structure was taken down.
So here's an interesting question, one I'll first ask Dr. Garrison to comment on, but I think I may have something to share. Were the Lincoln properties and 4th Parish planned around Hingham, or Hingham planned around them? So why don't you take a stab at that, Dr. Garrison, and then I'll.
Oh, I couldn't, you would know far better than I. My analysis of the house, I'm reasonably confident with, but not in terms of the precise layout of the North Parish. What I find very interesting actually is the portrait of Benjamin Lincoln, the small one that John Reuben Smith did. When I did the photography on that several weeks ago with a very, very strong light, we found on the chair rail of it that it's dated, and I believe the date is either 1800 or 1801. I'd have to go back and recheck my detailed shot of it. But what appears to be the North Parish Church appears in the window behind Benjamin Lincoln. And the North Parish Church was actually built several years later. It may have been under construction when that portrait was done. And one other detail that Jeff Klee pointed out to me when I shared the image with him was that the window behind Benjamin Lincoln is not the window in the parlor today. So it is in fact it's a 6/9 light window, and the window that's there today is a 12/12 light window. So There's lots of interesting details to be figured out as people look at the portrait, look at the house, and think about the dating of things.
So what I can add to partially answer this question, were the Lincoln properties and Fourth Parish planned around Hingham or Hingham planned around them, is that the Puritans who first settled here assigned lots to people for their homes and then other lots for their farms. There was planning in that sense, in that the town was organized geographically in that way. And related to that, there's a virtual walking tour that has been created as part of this series. If you are a subscriber to the full series, it basically is the 8th program, but it's coming up in that we expect to launch this web-based virtual tour within this next week or so. And there will be a lot of information in there about all of the structures that are still standing that would have been there during Benjamin Lincoln's lifetime and who lived in them. And you'll see the relationships between families. And so the town grew up around these families as well as around the structure. But there was planning to start with in terms of how the Puritans assigned lots. And there's a lot of information in the various histories that have been written of Hingham that details that. So great question, thank you for that. And subscribers, you'll be hearing more about that virtual walking tour coming up very soon.
I can add that, in fact, Hingham was not unusual in this. It was typical in the layout of these very early 17th century communities to partition things according to home lots and various kinds of fields, because all farmers really wanted different kinds of lands. They needed tillage land, they needed meadow land, they needed pasture land, they needed woodland, because wood was their chief fuel.
So here's a question from Ellen Miller, who you talked about earlier, which we've touched on a little bit, but a little bit different angle in her question. Was it common for homes to be physically divided when they were shared? And part 2, was it common for a building to be built as a duplex?
There were examples, particularly in the 19th century, there are purpose-built buildings that are built as duplexes, what we would sometimes call double houses. Those become way more common. What we see in the 18th century, depending on the place in which you're trying to discuss, there are clearly townhouses which are contiguous with one another, but are in fact separate dwellings. There are certainly places that I have seen. There was one in Deerfield, in fact, where there was a door that joined 2 sections of the building that were built. It's now known as the Barnard Tavern and the Frary House. But there were 2 sections of the building. One was the original dwelling house, and the other was a tavern addition that was put onto it, in which a different branch, a younger member of the next generation lived. So is it known? Yes. Are they common? It varies from town to town. It varies a bit according to population density, because the higher the population density, the more you're really confined by the market price of the land or the real estate in which you're located. So if you're in Boston, it's a different story than if you're in Hingham. If you're in Norwell or Plymouth, it's different again. And it varies in part because the landscape and environment itself shapes how people did things and the choices that they could make. That's part of the lesson here. It's this interplay back and forth between the material culture, the needs of families, and the fact that families aren't just static. They have their own life courses in which people age, they are young, they grow older. We all know this. But there are times when we study history where we forget this dynamic quality to all families is occurring in these houses that seem to be static, but in fact have to change to accommodate the life courses of the families who live in them.
Good point. And there's so much sociology in the way you explore structure. I find that quite fascinating.
You might even note that Mary Lincoln, because you're going to do a women's study later on, Mary Lincoln, if you looked, gave birth to children about every 2 years. And that actually is part of the demography that has been done on early New England, in which mothers who nursed for a year after the birth of their children have a very regular birth interval between the arrival of their children. Mary had a lot of children, and that large-scale house would have accommodated a large number of people. We should not assume that other kin members of the family we should assume that they might also from time to time have lived in the house.
So here's a great question. Would you recommend that the Hingham Historical Society attempt to restore the kitchen to its appearance of an earlier era? And if so, what era?
I wouldn't recommend. The kitchen is perfectly accurate as it is today. It's accurate to the 21st century and the ways in which the family lived in it. And anything that you do to try to put it back to an earlier period of time is going to end up being conjectural. So I would find other ways of doing that. Also bear in mind that there are easements on the house that Historic New England has, and any changes made to the house will have to take into account the preservation easements that already exist. So what I think you have is actually a quite extraordinary record of the house as it has evolved over time with its bathrooms, with its furnace. I know at some point you're going to probably have to replace the furnace, but I would leave it as it is, as part of the record of the family.
So I think your lecture itself has given us a little bit of an answer to this question, which is, how do you interpret an 11-generation home site?
Well, I think how I would interpret it as the ways in which family sense of the house evolves over time, because Benjamin Lincoln must have been acutely aware of the earlier phases of his house, and yet he wanted, when he and his wife Mary altered the house or had their builders alter the house, he was perfectly prepared to recycle the old in the remaking of the family patrimony. When you get into more recent eras of the family, they in turn, in part based on his memory and his service during the Revolution, they began to historicize and began to think in terms of the preservation of the house as a legitimate end in its own right. And so that's something that I think is actually a really important part of the interpretation. The family becomes increasingly conscious of its historical record, of preserving its legacy. And you have other examples of this in Hingham, notably the Cushing Farm, in which members of the family not only consider themselves occupants of the family house, but they are in effect the curators of the family house and its history. That's a really important part of this story about thinking of Hingham not just as a living community and neighborhood, but as in fact as a living memory.
So there are a few more questions specific to the house, and then there are some other questions about other properties owned by the Lincolns that you may or may not have the answers to, Dr. Garrison. I'm going to start with the ones on the house. So question is, it looked like there were 3 stairwells in phase 2 and then only 2 in phase 3 or 4.
There are actually there are actually 3 stairways in the house today, and 1 stairway down to 2 separate basements. So there's a basement under the phase 2 portion of the house, which you enter from the L, and there's a basement stairway that goes down to the basement under the phase 3 section of the building, which might have been part of a basement for a phase 1 building. There are 3 stairs to the 2nd floor. There are 2 stairways up to the attic area. So it's actually a little more complicated than might be visible on the main floor. To the extent that I can figure this out, and I'm not the only one who's looked at this, we think that the stairways, the 2 stairways to the 2nd floor on the phase 3 section of the building were built as part of the phase 3 section. The phase 2 house had a single staircase that ran all the way up. Whether there would have been a back stairs or not, short of tearing apart sections of the building, we can't really tell that yet.
So a complicated three-part question from Gary Tondorf Dick, who has just enough knowledge to give you something that sounds very complex to me. Did the Phase 1 house face east of the partially intact hearth behind the new formal stair? Would the existing chimney stack have been located on the west of the Phase 1 half house? And then a final part, why was the Phase 1 house raised? So I can repeat any of that if it would be helpful.
The short answer is we don't know. There are simply things that we can't learn short of tearing portions of the building apart, and that doesn't seem to be advisable for a whole host of reasons. We have puzzled, many of us, over the location of a chimney stack for the Phase 1 position of the house. So far as we can now tell, the existing chimney stack in Phase 2, that is to say the western chimney stack, is part of 1721, although they have added a furnace flue into it. So portions of it have been either altered, rebuilt, or subtracted. We think that the eastern chimney stack was altered, essentially is in the general location of where a chimney stack may have existed in the Phase 1 period. But if so, it was so thoroughly changed over in the mid 18th century renovation of the structure that it fundamentally obliterated what would have been there before. But that would suggest that the building would have originally been south facing rather than east facing. People in New England tended, although they're very strategic about this, they tended to take advantage of south facing elevations given the sun inclination during winter months for both light and heat. But I have seen them angle their building orientation to take advantage of the workspaces of the house on south-facing elevations. So it depends on the circumstances and where lot lines are located.
A new question. The 1767 date is before the Revolution.
Yes.
So Lincoln made his house grand before he became a more famous person.
Yes.
Did Lincoln do things to accommodate important visitors after the war?
He may have, and we don't in fact know for certain. You can't always tell when things are done, and there are a lot of dangers to trying to date too much stylistically. The house would have been a very impressive house, even in the post-revolutionary era. That grand staircase would have been highly impressive, even in the 1790s, when people think that things are being remodeled in a more neoclassical sense. Clearly, they put a mantel shelf into the southeast parlor on top of that, just above the Belection molding. You may have seen that in the slides, and they added that Federal era mantel in the dining room to upgrade that a little bit. But what strikes me about the house is how selective they are about later changes. I think the windows got changed, but I think that's because the windows were improvement to lighting. And the motivation behind certain changes are really important to think about, because sometimes we do things because they're practical, and sometimes we do things because they're fashionable. And what the Lincoln family seems to have done in the post-Benjamin and Mary Lincoln world is they're very strategic about what they do. They're perfectly prepared, particularly in back areas, to recycle, reuse, and make do. And yet in front areas, when they do things, they're very careful to do things in a stylistically modish fashion. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, if you think about it, having a historic house by the middle of the 19th century that dates back to a Revolutionary War general would have been a high status item. Converting things into Victorian society is not necessarily a good idea if you're maintaining the family's status based on its contributions to an important historic moment. So there's a lot of reason. You see this in England too, where the great country houses, in fact, preserve earlier architecture because it talks about lineage, about the linear family over long periods of time. And that's what you save. Changing things primarily for fashion is sort of a nouveau riche kind of thing to do at times for many people, particularly to conservative Yankees.
So one more question about the house and then a few related questions about other properties owned by the Lincolns. Question about the house. Do you know when the first plumbing appeared in the house? Bathroom or running water, etc.?
I do not. And again, the house, so far as I know, has not really had archaeological treatment, nor for that matter do I know precisely when various aqueducts or running water would have been inserted into Hingham's infrastructure. The house, as you know, sits below grade. There's a hill behind it. So it would have been perfectly reasonable to have various forms of running water from wells up above the house, but I don't know if that's the case. There is a well, at least a well house there now, and it is very common to have a well located right at the dooryard behind where the kitchen is located. So that well may in fact go back through time quite a ways and might have had a pump in it, not just a well bucket, but I don't really know, and I can't, short of doing archaeology, as I say, I can't begin to tell you. It's widely variable in other New England houses to see running water and plumbing. I have seen instances where running water is available in many parts of colonial America if you're wealthy enough and your environment is well situated enough to have running water in wooden pipes even very early on in the 1770s or 80s. But whether the Lincoln House had it that early or not, I couldn't begin to tell you at the moment.
Okay, one more question that's really related to the house structure itself. General Washington and General Lincoln were close friends. Did they share approaches in the evolution of their two homes?
They did. If you've ever spent quality time at Mount Vernon, and some of my former students work at Mount Vernon emerged over a very long period of time. And Washington had means that Benjamin Lincoln never did. It's important to understand at the time of his death, Washington was probably the third wealthiest man in the United States in 1799 at the time of his death. That's based on Alice Philip Norton's research. Much of that would have been in land, but Mount Vernon evolved from a relatively posh but normal Tidewater, Virginia style house through multiple periods of enlargement that would have added second floors on, would have added places to the east and west, and would have added flanker buildings and outbuildings behind it. So it was a whole complex, a campus, if you will, of buildings. And Washington was simply working at a different level. But in the sense that Mount Vernon had multiple additions to it, yes, there are clearly parallels. It might be worth knowing, although it surprises people, that Mary Washington at the time of her death occupied a very small room in the upper story of the building and not the Washington bedroom where her husband died.
So a few questions about other Lincoln properties that are related, and they relate to the ale house or malt house and the farmlands. So the questions are, were there any archaeological traces? Do we know of the malt house? Where were the farmlands? Were they adjacent to the house, and how extensive were they? How many acres was the farm? I don't expect that you have expertise on any of these questions, but I'll throw them out to you first.
Well, interesting, I've been asked about malt houses before when looking at the house, and particularly in conjunction with the shed out behind the house. Malt was a really important source of leavening for bread making in the past, not just for brewing, although it was important for brewing as well. Typically, most areas that are malt houses require a fair amount of fresh water. And it's not clear to me that the Benjamin Lincoln House in its current location would have been a good place for that level of water. It also malt requires a fair amount of heat, a lot of wooden tubs, a certain amount of space. You don't need huge amounts of space, but my guess is that the malt house was probably not located in the immediate area of the house, but would have been located not too far away. Also, it's not clear to me whether the family members owned a malt house or were themselves malters.
Okay, although there was in a will from Major General Benjamin Lincoln's father to him, he was passed, or not in the will, but he was given partial ownership or total ownership in a malt house. So I think there was some ownership. More broadly, to just address these questions, we are continuing to uncover information from documents, some of them that were in the home that the still current owners have given us access to, but much that does reside in Mass Historical Society.
Right.
We know that the way the Puritans divided property in the beginning, generally you had a home property, a site for a home to be built in the town, which was really this historic downtown area initially. And then farmlands that might be considerably further away, more in the direction of South Hingham. In the case of the Lincolns, we know that they had some business operations in North Hingham over on the Weir River. We know of an orchard property that I believe was on the Broad Cove coastline. So there were disparate parts of this property, much of it managed for commercial purposes to support the family. And we're still continuing to document what we can from the access we have today to documents, and then from the future access that we'll get over time. So we can't answer all those questions today, but generally we would not see extensive farms right adjacent to these downtown properties. They would be more in the direction of South Hingham. So with that, let me just, I think we've answered most of the questions. I just wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for sharing your insights, your thoughtful commentary about how people lived. I think when people think about architecture, sometimes they would expect someone in your position to talk exclusively about structural aspects. And the way you have woven through observations and hypotheses about how people lived and how the family adjusted the house based on their lives and their needs was quite instructive. I think that there's so much more to discover over time, but you've given us a wonderful opening to understanding what this house represents into this long period of time where the Lincolns have preserved this treasure. So thank you for that. There are a few points that I need to make sure I make before we close this out. So let me get to my notes so I don't forget any of them. First, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a subscription to the full lecture series, you will be entitled to the exclusive access to our upcoming launch of the virtual self-guided tour of Benjamin Lincoln's neighborhood, the neighborhood as it was during his lifetime, much of which exists to some degree in the structures that remain. You should receive this link probably later this week. So be looking for that. And I just want to mention that this new online tour was created by a dedicated team within the Education Committee, team led by Ruth Gilbert Whitner. And we also owe much thanks to Ellen Miller, who was mentioned tonight, this afternoon, to Michael Achille, to some Hingham High School interns who worked on this tour as well. So it was a wonderful team effort. So look forward to that. Next, our November program coming up, which we've also talked a little bit about, is the role of Hingham and New England in slavery and the triangular trade. And we really look forward to that. We continue to gather information for Wayne Eckerson, who's doing this lecture, and it will be a work in progress, but I think there'll be a lot of interesting information that comes to light in that lecture. And finally, for those of you who would once again like to join us in a post-program visit with other members of today's online audience, you should now have an invitation that came into your email while this lecture was in progress, inviting you to come to a new Zoom that will be starting in a few minutes, so you can talk a little bit about what you learned today. The Education Committee will have some members on it to talk about what's coming up. And we look forward to seeing and hearing all of you. But thank you again so much to Dr. Garrison for spending this wonderful time with us today.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.